"You have no choice, Clara." The words burned in her mind as the wind tore through the narrow alleyway, snowflakes whipping against her thin cloak. Clara Whitmore's fingers clutched the crumpled letter from her father, the edges damp and curling from the sleet. Her breath formed small clouds in the icy air, each exhale trembling with fear and desperation. The estate's creditors had arrived without warning, their black carriages gliding through the frozen streets like ominous shadows, and now she found herself alone on the cobblestones, the lamps casting long, wavering shadows across the glistening snow. She tightened her shawl around her shoulders and forced herself to take another step, each one heavier than the last, until the distant silhouette of a towering mansion emerged through the falling storm. Nathaniel Hawthorne, the grieving duke, stood on the frost-covered steps of his ancestral home, his tall frame wrapped in a heavy coat, eyes sharp and calculating beneath a shock of dark hair lightly dusted with snow. The air around him seemed to hush as if the world itself acknowledged the gravity of the encounter. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, a mixture of relief and dread swelling in her chest. Every instinct screamed to turn back, yet the knowledge that her family's future rested on her compliance forced her forward. The Duke's gaze followed her every movement, assessing, measuring, unyielding. She swallowed hard, the icy wind catching in her throat, as she finally reached the top of the steps, each footfall echoing against the stone. "Step inside, Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice low and controlled, carrying an authority that made her knees weak. She obeyed, crossing the threshold into a great hall where shadows clung to the corners and the firelight flickered across gilded portraits and towering windows. The air smelled faintly of old wood and polished stone, mingled with the subtle warmth of the hearth. Clara could barely take in the opulence. Every surface gleamed, every drapery heavy and dark, the sort of grandeur that was meant to awe and intimidate. She felt the weight of countless eyes upon her, though none were visible, as if the house itself judged her. Nathaniel's figure remained statuesque at the far end of the hall, hands clasped behind his back, eyes never leaving her. For a moment, time seemed suspended, the storm outside fading to a mere whisper, leaving only the tension between them. Clara forced herself to meet his gaze, noting the faint lines of grief etched around his eyes, the slight slump of shoulders that hinted at a sorrow he carried in silence. She dared a small nod, acknowledging her fate, and the Duke inclined his head once, a signal both of command and acknowledgement. Every step she had taken, every choice she believed she controlled, had led her to this singular moment. The offer was clear, unyielding, and frightening. A life bound to the will of a man she scarcely knew. A man whose mourning heart might yet hold mercy or indifference. Yet as she set her hand upon the carved railing, brushing away snow and frost, a flicker of something unexpected stirred in her chest. An ember of courage, a spark that whispered that perhaps this encounter, this chilling bargain, might not be the end, but the beginning of a path neither of them could foresee. Clara followed Nathaniel through the echoing hallways of the mansion, her footsteps muffled by the thick, patterned carpet that swallowed the sound of her uncertainty. The windows along the corridor were tall and narrow, their panes frosted over, casting fragmented reflections of the flickering candlelight that lined the walls. Each portrait along the passageway depicted a figure draped in somber attire, faces pale and eyes serious, as if silently observing her every movement. The Duke led her into a smaller sitting room, heavy curtains drawn against the late afternoon snowstorm, the air rich with the scent of aged wood and polished leather. He gestured toward a chair with a controlled but subtle authority, his eyes not leaving hers as he waited for her to sit, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken tension that lingered between them. Clara lowered herself into the chair cautiously, smoothing the folds of her damp cloak over her lap, her fingers still trembling from the cold outside and the weight of the decision that had brought her here. Nathaniel crossed the room slowly, the faint creak of the floorboards under his polished boots punctuating the quiet that hung between them. When he stopped just a few feet away, Clara could feel the gravity of his presence, the silent command inherent in his posture, the restrained strength that seemed to radiate from him without a single word. For a long moment, neither spoke, the firelight flickering across the room and illuminating the sharp lines of his face, the the shadowed hollows beneath his eyes telling of loss and years spent in solitude. Clara's gaze dropped to her hands, twisting the edges of her cloak as she gathered the courage to look back up, to meet the eyes that seemed to peer into her very thoughts. Nathaniel's expression softened imperceptibly, though the chill in his demeanor remained, a careful balance between authority and quiet curiosity. He gestured to a side table where a decanter of water and 2 glasses stood, and Clara rose to pour them, the glass cold in her hands, condensation forming along its surface. She handed one to the Duke, their fingers brushing briefly, and the spark of warmth from the simple contact sent a shiver up her spine that had nothing to do with the winter chill outside. The Duke accepted the glass with a measured nod, lifting it in acknowledgement before taking a careful sip, his eyes never leaving hers. The silence stretched, thick and deliberate, a delicate dance of observation and restraint. Clara realized that she was learning more in these quiet moments than she could from any conversation, each glance, each subtle movement revealing more about the man before her than the words he had yet spoken. Nathaniel finally inclined his head slightly, a motion that was both a command and an invitation, signaling her to speak. Clara took a deep breath, the cold still lingering in her lungs, and found her voice, quiet but steady. "I will do whatever is necessary to settle my father's debt." The Duke's gaze softened again, a hint of the burden he carried behind the veneer of control, and he said, "Very well, Miss Whitmore. You will be safe here, and I will see that no harm comes to you or your family, though it will require patience and obedience." Clara nodded, the words both comforting and daunting, as she realized that the mansion, so imposing and filled with shadows, might also offer shelter, and that the path she had feared could lead to unexpected understanding and the faintest glimmer of hope. The sound of the wind outside intensified as Clara stepped into the grand dining hall, her boots clicking softly against the polished stone floor. Nathaniel moved ahead of her with a measured stride, each step exuding authority and calm control, the length of his coat brushing the edges of the thick rug. The room was vast, its high ceilings lost in shadows, and the flickering chandeliers cast golden light that danced across the polished oak and velvet draperies. Clara could feel the chill of the room despite the fire burning in the hearth, as if the mansion itself held the memory of long-forgotten sorrows. She followed Nathaniel to the table, noting the careful placement of silverware and the subtle scent of aged wood mixed with the faint aroma of herbs simmering from the kitchen below. The Duke gestured toward a chair, his eyes meeting hers briefly, a silent invitation that carried both expectation and reassurance. As she seated herself, Clara noticed a stack of letters tied with a crimson ribbon on the sideboard, each one addressed in Nathaniel's precise hand, the elegant script a reminder of the meticulous life he led. The Duke poured tea into delicate china cups, his movements deliberate, almost ceremonial, and placed one before her with a slight nod, his fingers brushing the edge of the saucer in a manner that conveyed attention without warmth. Clara accepted the cup, the porcelain cool against her palms, and lifted it to her lips, savoring the brief moment of respite as the aroma of brewed leaves mingled with the soft crackling of the fire. Silence settled over the hall, heavy and deliberate, as if the room itself observed the unfolding encounter. Nathaniel's gaze swept over her, noting the tremor in her hands, the careful composure she maintained despite the weight of the day, and Clara felt both exposed and understood in the same breath. She set her cup down gently, her eyes rising to meet his, searching for a hint of what lay beneath the restrained expression, the grief and solitude that shaped his presence. Nathaniel finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "You are here because there was no other way, yet you have arrived without complaint. That shows a measure of fortitude I did not anticipate." Clara's lips parted slightly, words poised but unspoken, as the reality of her situation sank deeper. She had been brought to the mansion under the shadow of debt and obligation, yet within these walls, guided by the calm, precise authority of Nathaniel, there was also an unspoken opportunity to navigate the uncertainties, to find small footholds of understanding and perhaps, over time, mutual respect. The firelight caught the faintest flicker in her eyes, a reflection of resolve meeting the quiet scrutiny of the Duke, and for a brief, suspended moment, The harsh winter storm outside seemed distant, the world reduced to the subtle interplay of shadow, light, and the careful balance of power and trust that hung between them. Clara drew in a slow breath, steadying herself as she prepared to step further into the life laid before her, aware that every choice, every measured step, would shape not only her path but also the delicate, evolving connection that Nathaniel had begun to extend in silence, a promise of order, of protection, and perhaps the faintest hint of compassion yet to be revealed. The evening shadows deepened as Nathaniel led Clara through the corridors of the mansion, each step echoing softly against the stone walls. The storm outside had eased to a steady fall of snow, but the windows remained frosted, casting muted light across the high ceilings and polished floors. Clara's eyes wandered, absorbing the intricate tapestries depicting generations of the Hawthorne family, scenes of hunting parties and elegant gatherings frozen in time. Each thread seemed to whisper stories of pride and sorrow, and she felt the weight of history pressing gently around her. Nathaniel paused at the foot of a grand staircase, his hand brushing against the carved banister, his posture erect and commanding yet not unkind. He gestured for her to ascend first, and Clara's boots clicked softly against the wide steps, the sound mingling with the distant crackle of the fireplace below. As she reached the landing, a small study revealed itself, lined with shelves that reached the ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes that smelled of age and ink. The Duke crossed the threshold behind her, eyes scanning the titles briefly, then resting on her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. She set her gloved hands on the edge of the desk, adjusting her shawl as she tried to steady her breathing. Nathaniel moved to a nearby chair and gestured for her to sit. She obeyed, her movements careful and deliberate, the firelight casting a warm glow over her pale features. He sank into the chair across from her, hands clasped, his gaze thoughtful, as if weighing not only her words but the very essence of her presence. Clara dared a glance up, noting the faint lines of melancholy etched along his jaw, the shadowed depth in his eyes that spoke of loss, discipline, and the long years spent in solitude. She sipped her tea, the warmth easing some of the tension that had coiled within her, and found courage to speak. "I am grateful for your protection, sir," she said, her voice soft yet steady, "and I will do my best to honor the trust you have placed in me." Nathaniel inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her words, the hint of a measured respect in his eyes. A long silence followed, filled only by the distant howl of the wind against the stone walls and the occasional pop from the hearth. Clara felt the quiet settle around them, a protective stillness that made the mansion feel less imposing, less threatening, and more like a place where possibilities, however uncertain, could take root. Nathaniel finally spoke, his voice low, deliberate. "It will not be easy, Miss Whitmore. You are far from the world you have known, and the duties ahead will test your patience and resolve. But I will guide you, and you will not face these challenges alone." Clara's shoulders straightened imperceptibly, a small flicker of relief passing through her chest, mingled with the gravity of the responsibility she bore. She realized that this introduction to his world, filled with its rules, its silence, and its weighty expectations, was the first step in a journey she had not chosen but could yet navigate. Nathaniel's gaze lingered on her, assessing, understanding, and perhaps quietly approving of her resilience. And for the first time since her arrival, Clara allowed herself a tentative thought, that beneath the cold formality and the imposing architecture, there might exist a sliver of trust, and perhaps even a connection that could grow in the shadow of circumstance, slowly illuminating the vast, quiet mansion with the promise of cautious hope. The late afternoon sun had begun to fade behind the snow-covered hills surrounding the mansion, casting long shadows through the tall windows of the library where Clara now found herself. The room smelled faintly of aged paper and waxed wood, the air cool and still except for the occasional crackle from the fireplace where logs burned low. Shelves lined every wall, filled with leather-bound volumes whose spines gleamed in the flickering light, and Clara could not help but feel both dwarfed and strangely comforted by the weight of knowledge and history surrounding her. Nathaniel moved quietly across the room, setting a small stack of documents on the polished table, his movements deliberate and precise, and then he stood with his hands resting lightly on the back of a chair, eyes fixed on her, as if measuring her readiness for what was to come. Clara sat, adjusting her gloves and shawl, her fingers brushing against the smooth surface of the table, tracing faint patterns in the wood grain, grounding herself in the moment. The Duke's voice broke the silence, calm but imbued with authority. "You must understand, Miss Whitmore, that life within these walls is measured by discipline, observation, and careful attention to detail. Every action carries weight, every choice has consequence." Clara nodded, her gaze rising to meet his, noting the shadowed intensity of his expression and the subtle lines of grief that softened the sharpness of his features. The wind outside rattled the window panes, a low, persistent sound that seemed to underscore the gravity of their conversation, and she realized that the storm, though distant now, still marked the rhythm of her new life. She spoke, her voice quiet but deliberate. "I will follow your guidance, sir, and I will do my utmost to meet your expectations." Nathaniel inclined his head slightly, a subtle acknowledgement of her words, and then motioned toward a window that overlooked the northern grounds, now a blanket of unbroken snow. "Observe the estate from this vantage. Note the paths, the gates, the hidden corners. Familiarity will serve you better than any instruction alone." Clara rose, stepping carefully to the window, the cool glass sending a faint shiver up her spine, and she peered out at the sweeping landscape, imagining the effort required to maintain order over such vast grounds, the solitude that the snow emphasized, and the sense of responsibility that she now carried. The Duke's presence lingered behind her, solid and measured, and she could feel the quiet weight of his attention without needing to turn. "You will be tested, Clara, in ways that cannot be predicted," he continued, voice low and unwavering. "Patience, observation, and resolve will be your allies. Remember that nothing in this house is left to chance." She straightened, drawing in a slow, controlled breath, the chill of the winter air filtering through the room and mingling with the warmth from the hearth. And for a moment she allowed herself to imagine a path forward where diligence and composure could bridge the gap between fear and understanding. Nathaniel moved to the fireplace, adjusting a log and watching the glow spread across the room, the shadows of his tall figure long and commanding, and Clara realized that in the quiet of this study, amidst the firelight, the shelves, and the distant howling of the wind, the first true sense of her new life had taken root, a mixture of structure, expectation, and the faintest glimmer of cautious trust that might grow with the passing days. The evening deepened, and the library's firelight danced across the high shelves, casting shifting shadows that seemed to stretch and bend along the polished floors. Clara Whitmore remained at the window, tracing the winding paths of the estate blanketed in snow, her thoughts tangled between fear, duty, and the faint flicker of something she could not yet name. Nathaniel Hawthorne moved quietly behind her, the soft scrape of his boots on the floor almost imperceptible, yet each step carried the weight of his presence. He stood beside her, just close enough for her to feel the controlled steadiness of his body, the calm measure of his breath, without the intrusion of words. Outside, the snow had begun to settle, turning the grounds into a white expanse that seemed to stretch endlessly, and the distant howl of the wind was softened by the thick walls, allowing only the sense of isolation to reach them. Clara turned slowly, meeting his gaze, and in that quiet, suspended moment, she saw the depth of his grief and the precision of his control, a combination that both intimidated and fascinated her. Nathaniel's hand rested lightly on the desk nearby, fingers brushing the smooth wood as his eyes tracked her movements, noting every subtle gesture, the nervous twist of her hands, the careful composure she maintained despite the storm outside, and the weight of her new reality. He spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "This house tests those who enter it, Miss Whitmore, not by force but by the measure of their resolve. Observe carefully, learn, and act with care. Every choice is watched, every hesitation noted." Clara nodded, swallowing hard, the warmth of the tea she had sipped earlier now replaced by the cold awareness of her responsibilities. She felt the gravity of her situation, yet the steady presence of the Duke, his measured authority and quiet attention, offered a framework within which she could find footing. The silence stretched, filled only by the soft crackle of the fire and the occasional shift of Nathaniel's stance. And Clara realized that understanding this man, this mansion, and her role within it would require both patience and observation. Her gaze returned to the window briefly, noting the footprints of deer along the snowy garden path, the wind bending the bare branches in a slow, rhythmic sway, and she imagined the diligence required to maintain the estate, the solitude of the Duke, and the careful balance of control and care that governed life here. Nathaniel finally moved closer, the sound of his coat brushing softly against the floor, and he offered a faint, measured nod, an unspoken acknowledgement of her resolve. Clara drew in a slow breath, feeling a tentative calm settle over her, the realization that while the mansion and its master were exacting, they also offered structure, protection, and a path forward. The subtle flicker of understanding passed between them, unspoken but potent, and for the first time since her arrival, she sensed that amidst the shadows, the firelight, and the quiet discipline of the Duke's world, there was a possibility of trust taking root, fragile yet undeniable, a small beacon against the chill of the winter night. The night deepened outside the tall windows of the mansion, the falling snow muted under the heavy drapes that hung from ceiling to floor, yet the world beyond seemed alive with the quiet whisper of winter. Clara Whitmore lingered by the window, her fingers lightly tracing the frosted glass as the soft glow of the fire illuminated the pale contours of her face, reflecting her thoughts that were a mixture of apprehension and tentative curiosity. Nathaniel Hawthorne stepped into the room, his tall figure framed by the doorway, the shadow of the storm outside etched across his profile. He carried an unspoken weight, the lingering sorrow of his past evident in the measured line of his shoulders and the subtle furrow of his brow. Clara turned to meet his gaze, and in the dim light, she could see not only the command and precision that governed his every movement, but also the faint traces of vulnerability that lay beneath, the grief of loss that had hardened him yet had not extinguished his capacity to care. He approached slowly, and Clara felt the quiet pull of his presence, steady and deliberate, without a single word being exchanged. The room itself seemed to hold its breath as he reached the desk and placed a carefully bound ledger before her, the weight of responsibility tangible in its presence. "These are the records you will become familiar with," he said, his voice low, resonant, and precise. "And in understanding them, you will understand the ways of this household, the balance of order and the subtleties that sustain it." Clara lifted the cover, the leather smooth beneath her fingertips, and began to scan the careful notations, the disciplined arrangement of figures and observations that spoke to the meticulous nature of the Duke's world. Nathaniel's eyes followed her movements, noting her attentiveness, the slight hesitation when encountering unfamiliar terms, and the determined steadiness in her posture. He offered no guidance beyond this, allowing her to explore and discover under the watchful weight of his presence, and Clara felt the duality of fear and fascination that this silent instruction brought. Minutes passed, punctuated only by the soft crackle of the fire and the distant sigh of wind against the stone walls, and in that quiet, Clara sensed the rhythm of the estate, the precision that maintained the delicate equilibrium between authority and care. Nathaniel finally moved to stand beside her, the faint scent of cedar and parchment enveloping the space, and he gestured toward a map of the grounds pinned against the wall. "These paths, the gates, the boundaries you see here are not merely lines on paper," he said, voice even and controlled. "They are measures of vigilance, of movement, and of the unseen patterns that govern the life here. Learn them well." Clara nodded, her pulse quickening as she traced the inked lines with her eyes, imagining the expanse of snow-covered land that stretched beyond the windows, the quiet beauty and the solitude that accompanied it. Nathaniel's gaze remained steady, the dim firelight catching the glint of his eyes, and she felt a subtle shift, a quiet acknowledgement that her presence, her efforts, and her attentiveness were being measured, not in judgment alone, but in the careful consideration of a man who had long relied on control to navigate a life shadowed by grief. For the first time since her arrival, Clara sensed that the mansion, the storm, and the meticulous discipline of the Duke's world were not simply obstacles, but a structure within which she might find footing, a space where the faintest spark of trust, the first glimmer of understanding, could begin to grow, fragile yet undeniable in the quiet of the winter night. The following morning, Clara Whitmore awoke to the pale light of winter filtering through the tall windows of the mansion, dusting the floor with a faint silver glow. She rose quietly, careful not to disturb the stillness that hung over the house like a living presence, and adjusted her shawl before moving toward the dining area. Nathaniel Hawthorne was already there, standing beside the long polished table, his dark coat draped over one arm, eyes scanning a ledger with deliberate focus. The quiet click of his boots against the wooden floor marked his approach as he turned to acknowledge her with a subtle nod, a gesture that carried both command and recognition. Clara poured herself a cup of tea, the warmth seeping into her fingers as she tried to steady her racing thoughts, and took a slow sip while observing the Duke as he moved around the room with measured precision, arranging documents and adjusting the placement of chairs, each motion deliberate and controlled. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and the lingering aroma of herbs that had been steeped the previous evening, and the distant howl of wind against the mansion's stone walls reminded her of the storm that had brought her here. Nathaniel's gaze occasionally flicked to her, noting the careful composure she maintained, the slight hesitation in her movements as she adjusted the table settings, and the attentive glimmer in her eyes as she absorbed the details of the household. He spoke finally, his voice low but carrying the weight of authority. "You will spend the morning reviewing the inventory and becoming familiar with the locations of each supply, the order in which things are maintained, and the rhythm of the estate. Observation is as critical as action here, Miss Whitmore." Clara nodded, her hands folding neatly around the warm cup, feeling the gravity of the tasks ahead, yet sensing a strange comfort in the structure Nathaniel provided. She moved to follow him as he gestured toward the rows of cabinets and shelves along the far wall, each labeled with precise lettering, their contents arranged in careful order, the attention to detail reflecting the disciplined mind of the Duke. As she began cataloging and noting her observations, Nathaniel remained nearby, silent but present, his eyes sweeping over her work, noting the focus and care she applied. Occasionally, he would offer a subtle adjustment, a nod here, a quiet instruction there, allowing her both independence and the steady guidance that seemed to define his presence. The hours passed, marked only by the quiet scratching of pen on paper and the soft whisper of the wind against the windows, and Clara found herself gradually attuned to the rhythms of the house, the discipline of the estate, and the careful balance Nathaniel maintained between authority and support. She realized that each task, each meticulous observation, was more than practical. It was a lesson in patience, composure, and quiet resilience, the kind of training that could shape not only her actions, but her understanding of the man who governed this vast, snow-covered domain. By midday, the sun had risen higher, and the room was filled with soft light, illuminating the orderly rows of shelves, the gleaming surface of the table, and the subtle warmth that now seemed to linger in the presence of the Duke. Clara took a deep breath, allowing herself a moment to appreciate the quiet power of the household, the disciplined kindness in Nathaniel's watchful guidance, and the faint spark of trust and understanding that had begun to grow, delicate yet undeniable, in the shared silence of the morning. The evening sky had darkened to a deep indigo, and the last traces of sunlight slipped away behind the snow-draped hills surrounding the mansion. Clara Whitmore stood by the large bay window, watching the moonlight glinting off the pristine white landscape, each branch and shrub outlined in silver. The quiet of the estate was almost tangible, broken only by the soft rustle of curtains and the distant crackle of the hearth fire that filled the library with warmth. Nathaniel Hawthorne entered the room silently, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the polished floor, eyes fixed on her with a steady intensity that was at once commanding and quietly attentive. Clara turned slightly, meeting his gaze, and in that unspoken moment, she felt the weight of the days that had passed since her arrival. Each challenge, each careful observation, and every subtle instruction had brought her to a fragile understanding of both the mansion and its master. Nathaniel moved closer, stopping a few feet away, the firelight catching the subtle angles of his face, and he inclined his head slightly, an acknowledgement of her presence and her perseverance. Clara felt a delicate tension in the space between them, a quiet gravity that spoke of respect earned and trust cautiously extended. The Duke's voice, low and controlled, filled the room. "You have shown patience, attentiveness, and understanding, Miss Whitmore. These are qualities that will serve you well here, in every corner of this estate." Clara inclined her head, her fingers resting lightly on the windowsill, the warmth of the fire behind her seeping through the room and mingling with the crisp cold that lingered in the shadows. She allowed herself a moment to breathe, absorbing the significance of his words and the subtle approval in his tone. Outside, the snow continued to fall softly, creating a serene hush that seemed to wrap the mansion in quiet protection, and Clara realized that within these walls, amidst the precise routines, measured instructions, and the vast silence that was never empty, there existed a structure that nurtured growth, understanding, and cautious confidence. Nathaniel gestured toward a small table near the hearth, a set of documents arranged neatly, and Clara understood without a word that the work of learning, observing, and integrating into the life of the estate was ongoing. Yet within it lay the opportunity to carve a place of her own. She stepped toward the table, her movements careful but assured, each step a testament to the resilience and composure she had cultivated since arriving, and Nathaniel's eyes followed her, noting her confidence and the thoughtful deliberation in her actions. The firelight flickered across his face as he spoke. Again, softer this time, a hint of the man beneath the rigor and authority. The estate, the household, and the routines are but a reflection of what lies within. The care, attention, and thought you invest here will not only shape your understanding of this place, but also reveal much about yourself. Clara nodded, the weight of the evening settling upon her shoulders, yet tempered by a quiet sense of purpose and clarity. In the interplay of shadows, light, and the faint rustle of the mansion around them, a sense of connection, subtle yet undeniable, had formed, a silent acknowledgement that the path ahead, though exacting and carefully measured, held the potential for trust, understanding, and a future quietly built on respect and cautious hope.